Gregory.
Yeah, just to give you a little bit of my background, I did my PhD at Princeton, focused on Yemen. I've written one book on Yemen called The Last Refuge, Yemen, al-Qaeda, and America's War in Arabia. I first went to Yemen about 19 years ago now, in 2003, as a Fulbright fellow. Went back as a fellow with the American Institute for Yemeni Studies. Later, I served for 2 years on the UN Security Council's panel of experts, which is charged with with monitoring and administering the sanctions regime in Yemen, which
Right.
developed in 2014 and is largely tied to the war that's going on there. Currently, I'm a non-resident fellow at the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington, and have been working on Yemen for about 2 decades. So yeah, that's sort of a short summary of where I come from and what I've been doing.
Fantastic. Well, for myself and for others, I appreciate your work and your intellectual prowess, let's say, too, for that. So I've had the pleasure of leading up to this conversation to take some look at in-depth work at your work and in-depth look at your work, and I'm enthralled by it. It's more of it's needed. I think more should be read. It's a shame, tabloids are filled with tabloid garbage, and we don't have things that are actually pertinent to lives in the world going on. And as we talked in the pre-chat, the language we even use around warfare, we detach ourselves from it so much, conflict. Well, it sounds
Mhm.
like an argument between two people, but why is it though, Greg? Why is this something that we become so, you might say, political amnesia around it, or detached from it? We don't even know it's going on anymore. I mean, there's so many events that are going on, and we seem to be more aware of them and have pushed this to the wayside and forgotten about it seemingly.
Yeah, I mean, I think this doesn't impact most people's lives on a daily basis in the West, in the way that previous wars did in earlier generations, World War II, for example, or
Right.
even Vietnam, in which the U.S. had, or a lot of allied nations had troops on the ground in different places, and the U.S. has been very careful, with the exception, obviously, of Afghanistan and Iraq in the immediate aftermath of September 11th, to fight many of these wars, sort of what now the Biden administration calls the over the horizon presence. So we use a lot of drone strikes, we use SEAL raids that go in. The U.S. and Western nations rely on airstrikes as well, and this is how we tend to fight these wars. And even the way that the Bush administration in 2001 and 2002 set up how it would go to war and how it would fund the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. There wasn't sort of a war tax as there had been with previous wars, and the Bush administration told people to go to the mall. And the idea was that the U.S. or people in the West could continue to go about their daily lives, even while these wars were taking place that were over the horizon, out of sight and out of mind. And that's, I think, at least in my opinion, that's one of the reasons that many of these, what I think Dexter Filkins, who was then of the New York Times, now the New Yorker, described as the forever wars, that's why they're still going on. And we're still seeing drone strikes in Somalia and Yemen, in places like that. Obviously, Yemen, the conflict has evolved and changed in recent times. But yeah, I think it was set up to make us forget about it, and to be able to go on and not think about what's being done in our name overseas.
Right. No, that's a good point too. What's being done in our names collectively overseas. That is a good point. In many ways, I've had conversations with people, other, vets, current veterans of recent wars, and just otherwise historians who I have respect for, and yet they always seem to either bring it down to the level it's just a tribalism. It's been going on for a long time. They seem to not know the current intricacies. They don't know the current elements that are involved, the funding of weapons, sides, and so forth. In many ways, the atrocities, the killing of both children, women, unarmed civilians. They don't know this. They are completely, as you say, it's over the horizon. We're completely disengaged from it. There's no news reports on it, and I think it does play a huge element into how the discussions on this side that we're talking about it, if we even do talk about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a good point. And all of these conflicts, I mean, I spend most of my time looking at Yemen, but I've looked at Syria and looked at, what's happening in Libya and Afghanistan as well. All of these conflicts, while they have local roots and there are some deep intricacies, anytime an outside power, whether it's the United States, the European Union, other allied countries are getting involved in these conflicts, they tend to shift and exacerbate pre-existing fault lines or pre-existing tensions or what was taking place on the ground. And I mean, you see this in Afghanistan, obviously, has a long history dating back to the Soviet Union in the 1970s, right, and then going through the 10-year war, and then the Taliban takeover, and then al-Qaeda finding a base there, and the U.S. invasion post 2001. And so it just, it goes on and on, but there's both a sort of an international context to this as well as a local context. And it's important to be able to see both things and to be able to walk and chew gum and keep your eye on both balls at the same time.
Absolutely. Good point there. No, it's a good point. You have to be able to zoom in, but also have the ability also to zoom out and see the full spectrum and the full picture unfolding in some respect. You have to be able to do that. What are from your research, from your, what's the feel? What's the feel in Yemen in respect to what's not being done? We now are, thankfully, and I say this proudly as someone who does support it, supporting the Iranians, especially the women on the ground in Iran for their uprising. And as we have in many other situations, and even if not supported, we've at least had news coverage of it. What's the feel in Yemen from their perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I can sort of give you a little bit of an overview of what's happened in Yemen as a way to lead into your question, which I think might help a little bit. So, I mean, the war in Yemen basically starts in 2014. So we're 8 years into this war that starts when the Houthis, this militia group up in the north, move out of their province, which is way up on the northern border with Saudi Arabia. They move into Sana'a. They put the president, who's a transitional figure, supposed to just be there for 2 years. They put him under house arrest, and they basically take over. They basically carry out a coup in Sana'a. The president eventually escapes, moves all the way south, escapes Houthi custody, Houthi territory, gets to Aden, asks Saudi Arabia to intervene, which Saudi Arabia does in March of 2015. And that's sort of the international aspect to this war. And basically what we've seen from March of 2015 up until really just, I guess, even this month, is the battle lines have sort of moved a little bit, but not tremendously. I mean, the Houthis pretty much after the first few months of the war, the Houthis were pushed back north of Taz, which is sort of a middle city, a city in central Yemen, and above Taz is what's traditionally known as the Northern Highlands. Below Taz is the lowlands, and the Houthis have control over most of the Northern Highlands. They have control in Sana'a. What's called the internationally recognized government has control in the south, but the internationally recognized government is sort of a fiction because it's made up of a bunch of different warring militias, which perhaps we can get into if we want to talk about some of the local intricacies, as you mentioned earlier, Matthew. But what's taking place in Yemen is, I think, for a while, and the war started, at least in the U.S., under the Obama administration. The Obama administration very quickly and very eagerly supported Saudi Arabia. In fact, Saudi Arabia did a rather weird thing when it announced the war, in that it announced that it was going to war not in Riyadh, but it made the announcement that it was beginning what it called, military activities in Yemen. It made that announcement from Washington, D.C., and that was an effort to make sure that the U.S. was on its side. The U.S. basically got in bed with Saudi Arabia. They set up a joint logistics and intelligence cell with the Saudis. But the U.S., in doing that, they put themselves in a situation that was really the worst of all possible worlds, in that they're tied to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, Saudi Arabia's main partner, but they have no control over the war. And in fact, there was a lot of worry under the Obama administration that the U.S. and U.S. officials, particularly then Secretary of State Kerry, could be brought up on charges of war crimes, because the U.S. was basically signing off on weapons packages to Saudi Arabia when the U.S. knew full well that, whether from a lack of training or a lack of caring, Saudi Arabia was using these weapons in a way that was guaranteed to kill a lot of civilians. And so there were a lot of preventable civilian casualties. And so, to get back to your sort of initial question about what's the feel in Yemen right now, Yemen's just coming out of a 6-month truce, which expired earlier this month on October 2nd. I think everybody is sort of resigned to more war. And really the reason for that is that right now it benefits the different militias, whether it's the Houthis or some of the individuals and groups within the internationally recognized government of Yemen, to continue war. It's really in nobody's best interest for peace. And we can explore why that is if you'd like. But right now, war benefits the militia groups. And so war is where we're headed, and more war. And I think that, as ever in these conflicts, it's the Yemeni civilians who are sort of the pawns who are caught in the middle who ultimately pay the price.
Absolutely. No, well said there. And they're the ones on the ground who are just trying to go about and live their life in the best way possible. They are the ones who are the consequence of these malicious actions and these volatile repercussions of these actions. You're right there too. I remember talks, and there are always being articles being written of John Kerry potentially brought up on charges for that too. And speeding up to now, it's 2022. Mm-hmm. Would it be accurate to say that from a regional power that Saudi Arabia really is not a regional power as it once was via oil and gas, being how the world as we're changing? We're changing in many ways. We're going greener. We're developing new industries. We're recomprising nuclear power in many ways. Is it almost allotting power to a country that doesn't really necessarily have that regional essence anymore, if you will?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I mean, we're seeing this right now play out on sort of the front pages of newspapers, right, with OPEC Plus, and Saudi Arabia is saying that they can't increase production, which of course has frustrated and angered the Biden administration, which was, yeah, I mean, I think we're seeing this play out on the front pages with OPEC Plus. The Saudis are refusing to increase production. Obviously, this makes the Biden administration quite upset. There's been a lot of sort of loose talk within the U.S. Over how it is that the U.S. can punish Saudi Arabia for this action. How can the U.S. utilize its leverage? And the U.S. has pretty significant leverage over Saudi Arabia, particularly when it comes to things like spare parts to the Saudi Air Force, when it comes to some of the technology that's being utilized by the Saudi military, which is really run by U.S. contractors in many cases. The U.S. has put different missile packages and missile systems into Saudi Arabia to protect Saudi Arabia at various times. And so Saudi Arabia, in retaliation for some of this talk, has sort of let leak that there's the possibility of selling off U.S. Treasury bonds and things, which of course is the last thing a Democratic administration wants right on the eve of midterm elections and what's going to happen. So in many ways, I think Saudi Arabia is a regional, it's certainly a regional power. How much it can sort of punch above its weight at an international level. It probably has more clout now than it did prior to Russia's invasion into Ukraine, particularly with the need for oil that, as you say, I think all the things that you said, Matthew, are true, that we're going greener, we're moving away in many cases, but we haven't quite moved away. And so Saudi Arabia knows that it still has this leverage, and it intends to use it. And the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia is Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, someone who, I think all evidence, including the CIA's evidence, suggests ordered the killing of Jamal Khashoggi about 4 years ago. He's somebody, I think there was an article today as we record this in the Wall Street Journal talking about Mohammed bin Salman often mocks President Biden as somebody who's old, who makes a lot of gaffes. This is somebody who is very close to the Trump administration, somebody in Mohammed bin Salman, but has not been close to the Biden administration. In fact, President Biden campaigned calling the Saudi royal family in many ways a pariah and saying they should be held to account. Of course, that ended very quickly after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, and President Biden took a trip this summer to Saudi Arabia, a trip that seemed to, whether there was a purpose to it or not, it didn't seem to fulfill whatever internal purpose the White House had. So Saudi Arabia, and even in Yemen, I mean, Saudi Arabia went to war with the idea that it would prevent the rise of a Hezbollah-like group on its southern border in the Houthis. Right. And basically the only thing that Saudi Arabia has done by going to war is A, increase the Houthis' strength domestically, and B, drive the Houthis in Iran closer together than they were prior to the war beginning.
Right. And, on a side note, you bring up something that I was going to bring up, so I'm glad you said that. Do you think with the ongoing, I say protest, but really I think more accurately, revolutionary spirit going on in Iran, whenever it would happen, if it's to happen, I think it will happen, an overthrowing of this regime. Do you think that would have a greater impact than most would think? The changing of the guard, as it were, in Iran, moving over, changing the spirit and changing the Houthis in Yemen.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I'm not sure how close the regime in Iran is to being overthrown. I think, like a lot of regimes, they will. I mean, basically, if you look at, say, the Arab Spring, for example, look at the examples of Hosni Mubarak in Egypt,
right,
and Muammar Gaddafi in Libya, Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen. So you think of those three. Mubarak goes to jail. Gaddafi basically gets killed. He goes to the grave. And Ali Abdullah Saleh he cuts a deal and goes home. But then you bring in the fourth example, Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And Assad basically, to quote The Godfather, went to the mattresses, and he's still in power.
Yeah.
And he's destroyed his country. But he's still in power. Now, he needed Russian support and he needed Iranian support to stay in power. But I think the Iranian regime, if it just looks throughout the region to see what it is that happens when revolutionary spirit sparks up, I think it has an example in Bashar al-Assad that it may prove tougher to uproot than we would like. But in the event that it did happen, in the event that the Iranian regime was overthrown, I think this would have a significant impact on the war in Yemen. I mean, the Houthis are very dependent upon Iran. The Houthis, the leader of the Houthis, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, he has been under UN sanctions, international sanctions, dating back into early 2015. So for more than 7 years now. So what this has done, basically, I mean, the Houthis are only recognized by two countries. They're recognized by Iran and they're recognized by Syria. The Houthis are very dependent upon Iran. Bashar al-Assad can't give them much support. He gives them sort of some verbal support. But in order to project power throughout the region, the Houthis need ballistic missile components that Iran is shipping and smuggling to the Houthis. I mean, the Houthis produce some stuff domestically, some stuff they can buy off the shelf and sort of repurpose it. But really, the key is the stuff that they can't either produce or get off the shelf, and that stuff comes from Iran. So in order to hit Abu Dhabi like they did, earlier this year, back in way at the beginning of 2022, they needed Iranian missile components to strike at Saudi Arabia. They need that, and if that was all of a sudden cut off, then the Houthis would be in a lot of trouble because they don't currently have an economic basis to support themselves as an independent state in Yemen. So they need a lot of this outside aid that's coming in from Iran, which is the Houthis, in not having this economic base. That's one of the reasons that if your listeners are sort of familiar with the conflict in Yemen, that the Houthis appeared so determined to take this province of Marib, this governorate of Marib, which is in central Yemen. And the reason they want to do that is because Marib has a lot of oil and gas. And Yemen's exports prior to the war, about 90% of their exports are oil and gas. That's basically, they don't have a lot of it, but what they do have, that makes up most of their economy. And so if the Houthis want to survive, and all of the oil and gas is in three governorates, it's in Marib, it's in Shabwa, and it's in Hadramaut. And the Houthis don't control any of those. And so if they want to survive long term, they need to get at least Marib, if not Marib and Shabwa. Shabwa would be much, much harder for a lot of different reasons, but they need that, and they need Iranian support. And if you cut off one of those, it's, you've cut off one of the legs and they can no longer stand.
Absolutely. That's a really good point there. And you're right. And I think that also brings us back to some of the things about the regional element, the regional conflict too, on the ground, like the more communal element. Does that play a factor in it too, with the weaponry, with the conflict, as opposed to zooming out, seeing it from the grander country element, but more from the communal regional element? Does that even play a factor in the progression of it?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the challenges in a place like Yemen is we talk about Yemen as sort of the one war. And I think there's actually three different wars, three overlapping wars.
Right. Yes,
so Yeah, there's this local civil war that's taking place
Mhm.
between the Houthis, the Southern Transitional Council, Islah, Tariq Saleh's forces, and just a variety of different forces that are basically all fighting to seize and hold and govern and administer as much territory as they can. So that's sort of the base level conflict. Grafted onto that conflict is this regional battle between Saudi Arabia and the UAE on one side and Iran on the other side. And then on top of this, you have sort of this international Western-led, U.S.-led primarily war on terrorism, war against al-Qaeda and ISIS, where the U.S. periodically is carrying out strikes. That war has sort of gone to a low simmer over the past several years, but it's still taking
Right.
place. And so at this regional level, absolutely. I mean, Saudi Arabia and the UAE, I mean, Iran, I think Iran in the war in Yemen, Iran is fairly similar and analogous to the US in Afghanistan in the 1980s.
Okay.
That is, that Iran is excited to see Saudi Arabia bogged down in Yemen. Iran is sending missile components to the Houthis the same way the US would send, say, Stinger missiles to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. And Iran has basically got Saudi Arabia to spend a lot of money, lose sort of the public relations battle that Saudi Arabia has lost because of the egregious civilian casualties, particularly in the early days of the war, and see Saudi Arabia have to use a lot of its political capital at the UN and other things when it was on, say, when it was named in, say, the UN Secretary General's report on children in armed conflict, and Saudi Arabia was named as somebody who was supporting children in armed conflict. So Iran hasn't spent that much money in Yemen, but it has seen its major regional rival Saudi bogged down in the
Yeah.
country and seemingly unable to find an exit. I mean, Saudi Arabia, back in April of this year, they pushed out President Hadi,
Mhm.
who had sort of well overstayed his time. They instituted this new 8-man presidential council with the idea that this was sort of put some sort of unity back on the internationally recognized government side for Yemen. But of course, these different, when you have this sort of Frankenstein construction of
Yeah.
eight different heads,
Yeah.
it's really unwieldy. And many of these different groups have been fighting previously, coming into armed conflict, and they've
Right.
continued to fight one another, even when Saudi is hoping they would just all get on the same side and all just fight their one common enemy in the Houthis. And the Houthis are great at sort of exploiting these fissures and fractures that exist within this. So yeah, the regional rivalries, the regional factor, most definitely, it's a two-way street. The regional rivalries are impacting the local civil war, and the local civil war in some ways is sort of exacerbating and inflaming the regional rivalries.
Right. No, and that's a good picture to present there too, Gregory. I like that. That almost brings us back to what you were saying earlier too about the Assad pretty much being the only one, although to destroy his country and decimate his country and kill his own people. With that Arab uprising, the Arab Spring, is there almost, in Egypt, you can say this too, Lebanon, unfortunately, I think you can say this. Would it be accurate to say there's almost not enough people to lead that spirit? People to take, a political democratic stance and say, hey, we're pushing it in this direction. We're pushing it somewhere. Here's the energy. Here's the youth energy. Here's the civilian energy behind us. But there's no one. There's a lot of energy, but there's nothing to hone it, as it were.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was in Egypt. I was living in Cairo on a Fulbright fellowship from 2010 to 2011. So I was there during the early days of the uprising, and seeing what happened. And I have obviously traveled to Yemen since and seen sort of the aftermath of the Arab Spring protests and the popular protests. I think the large takeaway that many of the protesters, and particularly the ones that I've spoken with, have is that, they work so hard to get rid of these, what at the time were termed presidents for life. I mean, Hosni Mubarak had been in power since 1981.
Yeah.
Ali Abdullah Saleh had been in power since 1978. These were long-serving presidents, and presidents who looked, by all accounts, to be preparing their sons to succeed them. And so these popular protests, they had such spirit, and it was it was very heady to live through the initial days of what was taking place in Cairo, and to see and to go to Tahrir, and to see what was happening. And one of the images that's I think forever burned in my mind is one of the first days of the protest, where there was just the line of black clad police that was lining up, and the people who were shouting, and just seeing the space between them, and just that conflict, and that the courage that it would take to stand in the street unarmed against these people. And I mean, Mubarak basically let loose his thugs, and I mean, there's a whole history we don't have to go into, but I think the point is that many of the protesters felt like they worked so hard to get rid of the presidents that seemed to be impossible to topple. And then later, what you had is well-established political groups or militia groups that came in and said, "Thanks for doing this. We never could do it, but you kids sit down and we'll take it from here." And in many ways, I think that spirit was hijacked, and it was hijacked by and I mean the protesters themselves. I mean, they were well organized in protesting, but after they lost that sort of focal point of, we want the president to fall, to step down, then they had a lot of disagreements over what exactly came next. And so you had then space that opened up for more well-established political parties or militias to step in and take the reins. And obviously we saw that take place in Egypt before the military took it back. We saw it in Yemen, and Libya obviously is in dysfunction. All of these countries are now broken in a way that makes you wonder if they can ever be put back together as states again. I mean, Yemen is deeply divided, has two economies. Libya has, dueling prime ministers. Iraq, sort of functions, but not really. And there's autonomous zones within it, and obviously with Muqtada al-Sadr's resignation from parliament. And so it just makes you, and Lebanon of course has its own very severe and serious problems. It makes you wonder, these countries that existed throughout much of the 20th century, or certainly post World War II, can they really survive as nation states? And if they can't, what sort of challenge does this present for the West, which is set up to deal with other nation states? What does it mean for the U.S. if you can only deal with, say, the internationally recognized government of Yemen, and yet the internationally recognized government in Yemen is in exile in Saudi Arabia and controls nothing on the ground? And so there are a lot of challenges that I think the West is going to have to deal with. But yeah, the Arab Spring was just such a powerful moment that ultimately was hijacked by other forces later.
Absolutely. No, and that, and in many ways, that I think I've always had a little comparison myself. I've always felt that was almost kind of a reverberation in some sense from the movement of the very conservative Islamist Arabic movement in the 60s that happened across the Middle East. Almost a reverberation for that, like a resurgence in many ways, but a modern adaptation of that, let's say, in many ways. It had a similar feel to it, similar movement, similar overthrowing, a similar flavor, but just for a new era in many ways.
Yeah, I mean, through the late 1940s, early 1950s, 1960s, I mean, the history throughout the Middle East, particularly in some of, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, in these countries, it was coup after coup after coup. And we hope that history isn't echoing now in the early 21st century, and we're going to see war after war after war. But it does seem as though now the top has been taken off. It's hard to see these countries remaining together in any sort of a functioning fashion, at least in the near term. I mean, there's hopes, obviously, and it's not for lack of trying, but this is not an effort that can be imposed by a UN special envoy in Libya or Syria or Yemen or wherever they happen to be. And the UN doesn't have, in many ways, the UN doesn't have a lot of leverage, and what it attempts to do, it often ends up doing the exact reverse of what it attempted. And, Yemen's a great example of that. Yeah,
no, precisely. I mean, I even had a discussion about the journalistic element, but also the history and culture, and then the current state too of Lebanon with Dala Mawad, and we talked very heavily on this. And she's like, we don't know. That's the thing. Right now it's the same thing. We all people on the ground there. They all know what's going on. It's not like detached from it. They're right there. And yeah, you're exactly right. I think you make a very, very good point there, Gregory, when you say, the government of Yemen or the government of X country might be in exile. How do you deal with this? How do you, as a country, as a Western nation, set up design with other nation states? How do you approach this? How do you deal with this? And going forward too, like how do we deal with that? How do we take these realities? But and does that mean going forward that we continue the West, specifically the U.S., to continue to do these deals, let's say, with Saudi Arabia, knowing full well what these arms are going for? We're not foolish. I don't think in the 21st century anyone, my listeners or anyone else in the digital age that we've been in for a long time, is foolish to know what's going on. Do you think voters particularly, or do you think us and more broadly in the Western world, for people in government, people in position like yourself, we would permit this to be going on? That we would say this is, it's ridiculous. This is ridiculous.
Yeah. I mean, that's a good question. So I think largely, particularly in the United States, politicians are not held to account for their votes on foreign policy, with a few glaring exceptions. There, sort of a truism in American politics is there are no votes in foreign policy. Yeah. And I mean, constantly the perception of what U.S. foreign aid is, most voters tend to think that it's way beyond the percentage that it actually is. And so what tends to happen is then that the White House largely, there are obvious constraints in some ways from Congress. Congress, though, typically polls, at least Congress as a body, polls well below whoever the sitting president is, whether it be a Republican or Democrat. And so the White House gets to largely set foreign policy. And you saw in the Trump administration that even when Congress sort of stood up and was unified and said, we're not going to okay these arms sales to Saudi Arabia, for example, the Trump administration found President Trump vetoed some of those, and he made some maneuvers. Secretary of State Pompeo made some maneuvers in which they classified it as emergency aid, and they were able to find workarounds and able to do what it is that they want to do. And then you see the Biden administration that comes in, and the Biden administration, I think, tried very hard early on to bring about an end to the war in Yemen. But the Biden administration quickly found that it had some leverage with Saudi Arabia and the UAE, maybe not as much as it thought, but B, it had no leverage with the Houthis. And so it could sort of compel the Saudis and the UAE to move a little bit here and there, but it couldn't compel the Houthis to sit down. And the Houthis, I mean, their basic attitude is, look, we've won these things on the battlefield. We're not about to sit down and negotiate them away at the bargaining table.
Absolutely.
And so once that happened, then the Biden administration found itself in a bind. They campaigned so heavily on ending this war in Yemen. President Biden, candidate Biden, was very clear on what he thought of Saudi Arabia and what he thought of the civilian casualties. And then you saw the Biden administration sort of contorting itself into knots by saying, well, we're not going to sell offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia, but we will sell defensive weapons.
Right. Yeah.
Of course, the difference between an offensive weapon and a defensive weapon is largely in how it's utilized. And so, and many of these weapon sales, they continue to go through under the Biden administration. So, the U.S. is, whether it wants to be or not, it's involved in the war in Yemen. Its reputation, I think, particularly in Yemen, where it was never high to begin with, has taken a hit because, and there's a great article, I think it's from 2018, you'd have to check me on that, from the New York Times Magazine, which basically traces the life of a missile as it goes from Arizona all the way to being deployed into Yemen, and then where it went in Yemen, and the people that it killed. And so it's just a fascinating look at how this stuff works in the 21st century.
Absolutely. No, I'm not familiar with that. I'm going to give that a look at that article. That exactly fascinating is exactly where the point of this conversation is. We seem so detached, yet we don't realize how very close we are to it. As we said at the beginning, at the top of the podcast, people seem not to talk about this or hear it on newsreels because we seem not to affect our lives, but we are very much intimately involved in this. We are
Well,
contributing.
that's the thing, right? Is it doesn't affect our lives, but our lives absolutely impact and affect the lives of
Yeah.
people in Yemen. And so it's very one-sided. But the "Made in the USA" label is
Yeah.
on some of these munitions that you see,
Mhm.
sticking out of the mud brick homes that have been destroyed, or the serial numbers that trace it back to a bomb that was made in the USA. The pilots are trained by American pilots, the Saudi and Emirati pilots. The planes are often American made. They're serviced by American mechanics. They're relying on intelligence that's coming from American satellites, and the list goes on and on and on and on. And the people in Yemen are not unaware of this fact. So
Oh,
while we
absolutely.
may
Yeah.
be unaware of what's happening in Yemen, they're very much aware that their fate is in many ways being decided in Washington and in
Mhm.
Riyadh. There's obviously a lot of anger at Saudi Arabia and the UAE, particularly in Houthi-held territories, from the civilians. But there's a lot of anger at the U.S. as well.
Absolutely. I wonder, Gregory, a thought comes to me. I wonder if the U.S. were to stop selling armaments to Saudi Arabia of any sort, under any guise whatsoever, would that stop almost what I presume is going on the ground by the Houthis and insurgents of narratives, perhaps of you may think we're bad, but we're here to protect you. Look what's going on. They're the ones deciding our fate. Because in many ways, I look at it as these actions also propitiate ongoing narratives, ongoing views that are being shelled out to either recruit or to subdue
Yeah.
people on the ground, to keep them quiet and to keep them, hey, you think it's bad now, look what's really bad, kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the actions, as you say, I think it's perfectly said, is from over the landscape, over that is having a great impact on perpetuation of this. And in a grander sense, certainly having a great impact on the revival in many ways, and the longevity of terrorist activity on the ground there too. I mean, it's contributing right to it. I mean, even in with the selling to Saudi Arabia, I mean, certainly they're selling off to partners as well to fight their wars as well. So it's having an immensely impact. I could never wrap my head around how someone can feel that they have no personal connection with it. You may not have a visual connection, seeing the atrocity, seeing the massacre of women, children, starvation, but we certainly have an impact. And you're right. They see that proudly made in America label
Yeah.
that has a gross reputation to it. That is causing an American reputation to be seen differently. I think for the first time in maybe 50, 30 years, being seen differently from abroad. And I think, what do you think about that? Do you think that has a role in that narrative element?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple of different things, and I think this is something that the Biden administration has wrestled with. What if we just say, we're not going to supply spare parts to your Air Force, we're not going to sell you weapons, we're not going to do any of these things, which it's cold turkey, we're cutting you off. I think when the White House, and particularly the national security, plays that tape out to the end, what they see happening is, yes, this probably limits some civilian casualties on the Saudi side, but what this does is it doesn't mean that the Houthis are going to stop. So now Saudi Arabia isn't able to provide air cover to troops in Marib, and Marib, the terrain there it's not the highlands. It's getting out into sort of the desert. There's some rolling desert, and then it basically becomes pretty flat as you get out to Marib city. So the Houthis can take over a lot of ground pretty quickly without any sort of air support. And so when the Biden administration contemplates doing this, then they have to look at the fact, well, we would weaken Saudi Arabia. We want to send Saudi Arabia a message, but the end result of that would be that the Houthis would take over Marib. And so if they take over Marib, as we said earlier, they'd have the oil and gas fields. So they take over Marib. So now they have a port on the Red Sea coast in Hodeidah. They have a capital in Sana'a, and they have exports now for oil and gas. Then out of Marib, they could very easily march into Shebwa, which they've done previously. And Shebwa also has another outlet to the sea. Shebwa also has oil and gas fields. From Shebwa, they could go into Hadramut. And so best case scenario in cutting off weapons to Saudi Arabia completely is that you allow the Houthis to establish the base to create an independent state. Worst case scenario is you allow the Houthis to basically take over all of Yemen. And then if you're doing that, then you basically have an Iranian light regime on the south of the
Right.
Arabian Peninsula in a place that is important to you. You're going to have to deal with refugee flows out of Yemen. So some of these would go into Africa, some would go into Saudi Arabia, and some would go into Oman, places that you probably don't want to see refugees heading into. Then you're going to have to deal with, I mean, we all saw what happened with that massive tanker got stuck in the Suez Canal.
Right.
We're having our own supply chain issues. The Houthis have put a lot of floating mines in the Red Sea. And so if you now have a group that has control over these shipping lanes, even if they venture out into international waters, then you have a security challenge and an economic challenge there as well. Plus, you need some troops on the ground in order to fight al-Qaeda and ISIS, because you're still sort of worried about them, even though they're basically on at their weakest point as they've been in a decade. And so I think that was the conundrum that the Biden administration found itself in is, look, we really want to do something because we know Saudi Arabia and the UAE are not acting in the US's best interest here. They're killing out a lot of civilians, but we don't, as bad as Saudi Arabia and the UAE are, and they are certainly bad. And I mean, there have been some fascinating and really hair-raising journalistic accounts, including one that won the Pulitzer Prize here in the United States, talks about the UAE using sexual abuse, sexual torture of prisoners in Yemen. America, the United States, was fully aware of that. But the Houthis torture as well, and the Houthis carry out crimes as well, and that's often lost. In Yemen, everyone has blood on their hands, and everyone has a lot of blood on their hands. And so I think that was the challenge for the Biden administration is, well, we want, and I think that's how they ended up tying themselves in knots, is that there just is no good side in the war in Yemen. The only good side are the civilians, and they don't have the weapons. And so that's the challenge. The other point that I would make is that the Houthis, I think in your question, I think you got it exactly right. The Houthis have used a rally around the flag effect and say, look, the U.S. is attacking us, Saudi Arabia is attacking us, the Emiratis are attacking us. And there's a lot of people in Houthi-controlled territories who don't necessarily support the Houthis, but who are willing basically to give them a pass right now because of the Saudi and Emirati airstrikes. And I think if the Saudis and Emiratis were to fully withdraw, then the Houthis would have to figure out how to govern. And they really haven't had, even though they've been in control in the north for the past 8 years, they really haven't had to govern in any sort of an effective or certainly an accountable way. And at some point, they're going to have to do that. I think the hope within the Houthi inner circle is basically that whenever that day comes, that we'll be so well entrenched, we'll have basically revamped government in our own image to the point that it will be impossible to get rid of us, because we know there are going to be some domestic threats. And they've been particularly active in weakening these tribal sheikhs, which are very, very key and very important in northern Yemen. And the Houthis have attempted to basically neuter them over the past 8 years, and also deal with the intelligence structure and make sure they have a firm hand on the military. Exactly the sort of things that you would go to if you're concerned about your own security.
Absolutely. I think we're spot on with there too, Gregory. I want to kind of get you something and say I wrong or disagree with you, but so far I agree with everything you've said so far. So you know what, and you pointed out a good thing, which is something I toil with myself when I think about it. When this conversation comes up with friends, is it seems, ethically we know we want to, but the realities seem almost not just so entrenched, but so tangled up that it's almost impossible to decouple. And doing it in a way where it's ethical, not where it's just, well, we're gone now, and now there's a bunch of bloodshed still on our hand because we pulled out and because we left. Yeah, it's such, and I think that's again, I think this is an issue, and correct me if I'm wrong, that goes over multiple administrations. This deep entrenchment. It's not just a two administrations or three for that matter, but a really entrenching. Going deeper in, more trade deals, more armaments, and so forth, to the point where it's as natural as getting elected and being in bed with them, kind of thing.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, decisions have consequences, and policy decisions often have policy consequences. And this is true over administrations. particularly in the United States.
Mhm.
And when the U.S. makes decisions under the Obama administration to set up a joint intelligence and logistics cell in Riyadh and basically tie the U.S. to the Saudi-led war in Yemen, that's the U.S.'s original sin in Yemen. That tells everybody that, hey, the U.S. is involved in this war, and but the U.S. isn't calling the shots. And I mean, when I was on the UN Security Council, there was a number of debates over whether we could consider the U.S. what international lawyers would call a party to the conflict in Yemen. And this was obviously something that the U.S. pushed back on quite vigorously, because the U.S. did not want to be considered a party to the conflict, which would open themselves up to all sorts of scrutiny, which the U.S. obviously wanted to avoid. Under the Trump administration, the U.S. made a number of decisions, whether it was trying to push back on Saudi Arabia and the UAE as they were headed into Hudaydah, or whether it was supporting the UN Special Envoy. It's same thing under the Biden administration when it's made some of its decisions to, say, lift the terrorist designation on the Houthis, which the Trump administration had put in place. So all of these, basically, what's happened over the course of the past, even if you look at just the past 8 years, is there's been a slow but very steady narrowing of policy options for the United States, because as time has gone on, the U.S. has continued to make decisions that then limited its options going forward. And now the U.S. is in a position where it really has no good options. The war's gone on for 8 years, killed, probably well over 400,000, particularly when you start talking about people who've died indirectly from the war, from starvation, malnutrition, things of that nature. That's, nearly 500,000 people. That's a tremendous bill when it comes to human lives. And the U.S. doesn't know what to do. It's not pleased with its allies in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which both of whom have demonstrated a callous disregard for human life in Yemen. It certainly doesn't want to be on board with the Houthis, which has imprisoned U.S. Foreign nationals who used to work for the U.S. Embassy, which has tortured people, which is close to the Iranian regime. And short of putting U.S. troops on the ground, which the U.S. is absolutely not going to do in Yemen, then it doesn't really know what its options are. And there's no real impetus, because people in the U.S. simply, the war isn't impacting their lives, as we spoke about before, so they don't care. And so the National Security Council, the White House, don't need to spend the time and the effort that they really need to end this conflict. And they don't have leverage, and they're up against the end of the U.S. influence when it comes to Yemen and being able to impact what's happening on the ground. And so the U.S. finds itself in a position where it's just stuck. And I think you've seen that over the past year, 2 years with the Biden administration. Simply doesn't know what to do. And so it just sort of muddles along, and it hopes something on the ground will change and that it will be able to call it a victory. And that just hasn't happened.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And it's been muddling along because I think the entrenchment has become the mud has become so thick and entrenched. They don't know what to do, which way to pull, how to get out, and how to get out, as previously said, how to get out in a way that's ethical, not just a way that's we're gone, goodbye, and the blood is still there, still flowing kind of thing. And I think you're right. It's been the past 8 years specifically, as you said, it's been perhaps some of the worst time with grosser and grosser policy, or lack of policy, and lack of direction as to what to do. And going back to my rallying around the banner, rallying around the flag statement, I think too, when you look at when the U.S. is an upholder, of liberating, bringing democracy, human rights, individual rights and freedoms. And I think that from abroad, trying to put myself in the shoes of another, when you're so coupled with Saudi Arabia, then you get looked at differently. And especially when, again, we're in an era now where it's that you can't really, nothing's so private anymore as you don't know what's going on abroad. You have journalists, boots on the ground, works of individuals like yourself, Gregory, and so forth, and people know the Western world, and people know abroad what's going on. And it's hard from a reputation standpoint. Do you think that specifically is something that the U.S., whether from a governmental standpoint or more collectively from a governmental and military standpoint, could ever come back from? Because it seems like it's getting a real, perpetually rocket launches of big hits to its reputation, and specifically from this coupling, as we could say.
Well, I'd like to hope
Hmm.
that the U.S. can come back from something like this. It's pretty to think so, isn't it? But I mean, there's just a multi-part series in the Washington Post that talks about U.S. generals, U.S. commanders who basically left the military and went right onto the payroll of Saudi Arabia and
Oh,
the
jeez.
UAE and helping them revamp and modernize their military. And obviously, when you're a general and you leave the military, the U.S. military, it's not like you take off your uniform, but you don't necessarily leave your Rolodex at the office.
Yeah.
And so these people are still deeply influential. And I mean, the Washington Post report, and it's a great series for your listeners. Just came out last week, I believe. At least a 3-part series that talks about focusing on Saudi Arabia, focusing on the UAE. James Jones, who was an advisor to President Obama, is one of the
Hmm.
individuals who's named there. And so this is not a partisan issue. It's something that Republicans, Democrats, in a ultra capitalistic system, you tend to go where the money is. And Saudi
Right.
Arabia and the
Right.
UAE have a lot of money. They're involved in things like sports washing and buying sports teams
Mhm.
and things of that nature. And they're not the only ones. I mean, Russian oligarchs do the
Yeah.
same thing. But yeah, one would hope that the U.S. can come back from this, that the electorate will demand better, that the politicians will be better.
Absolutely.
You can look at things like January 6th and what's happened and the current rhetoric in the lead up to the midterm elections here in the United States, and,
Mhm.
and that hope is misplaced. But hope is about all we have left, I think, at this point.
Absolutely. Even in there's a good Persian quote. I think it's quite appropriate. It might be by Khayyam. I'm not quite sure, but it goes, the in the darkest of hope, the breaking of dawn is the renewal of that hope.
Mm-hmm.
So every darkest moment has its breaking of day, the
Right.
renewal of light. So I think there is. I think there is. I think we might not see it. It might be on the horizon, but I think it definitely. I think there needs to be that resurgence. There need to be an appreciation of what do we stand for? What are our values as much domestically as abroad? And what are we putting abroad of ourselves? I
But I mean,
think,
the U.S. has been through this before. I mean,
yeah,
obviously, reputationally wise, there's Guantanamo Bay, there's
yeah,
Abu Ghraib going back farther, what happened in Vietnam. There's been a number of atrocities that
mm,
the U.S. has been involved with. I think the thing that has been different in the 1970s, obviously, as we're coming out of Vietnam, there's the Church Committee, which uncovers a lot of what it is that the
right,
CIA does, which then leads to new laws. But to have something like that, you really need people who, at the ground level, are awake to what it is that's being done in their name and are
right,
upset about it enough to put pressure on elected officials that they will actually change the law. And because a lot of stuff over the past 20 years since September 11th, a lot of stuff has happened and has been
mm,
done in the name of Americans, and it's been carried out in secret, that I think if it were all to fully come to light, I don't think most Americans would be proud of
right,
what is being done.
right. No, the so-called war on terror has shown itself not to be what it proclaims to be for over the last 20 years. I think in the last 20 years, politics, specifically in the U.S., I'm someone who lives in Canada, but I said, we share a border, and not just the television, but I do keep an eye on it, and the unfolding and the reconfiguration of politics in America, and foreign policy and domestic policy, for that matter, has probably sped up and become so peculiar, such an oddity in many
Yeah.
ways in the last 20 years. And you can really say, like, the pre and post 9/11 American politics, domestic and abroad, have really reshaped politics on a state level as much as a federal level. It's
Mm-hmm.
really reshaped it, and the feeling of it too. The feeling of politics, what even words like conservative and liberal mean anymore, seem to be at the discretion of the user. They don't even
Mm-hmm.
have to have some fervent meaning anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that says a great deal where things have come from, and now where they've gone, and certainly at this particular interval where they are,
Mm-hmm.
in respect to that. And I think it does, whether we like to accept it or not. I think it does have a massive role to play, that this ongoing, you might say, tiff or conflict or not knowing where we are politically, let's say, over the last 20 years has had a huge impact abroad as to what policies, the swift changing of a policy here, and a swift changing of a policy this way.
Yeah.
And, I think on a final note, Greg, I'd like to ask you, I think like individuals like yourself, journalists especially, those within the armed forces in the US and those within intelligence services seem to, in some respects, not in all, I don't know, no pedestals on my end here, but everybody seems to have a greater insight, whether it's because of us specializing in an area, but it seems that as to your remarks prior, I think, is it the case that too many politicians, regardless of party favoring, seemingly do not have the understanding of what's going on abroad? Maybe a briefing is delivered at some point, whether you're a congressman or woman, or a president, whomever. Would it be fair to say that there is not enough knowledge to the American people, whatever they are, whether they're working their 9 to 5 jobs every day trying to get by, or whether they are in politics? They just are fully not aware of it. And the information, the intel coming to them, do they fully accept the reality that they're being presented with?
Yeah, I mean that's a good question and a big question. My view is that the incentives in the American system particularly are skewed, and so people who are just part of the electorate are not incentivized really to know. It has to be sort of self-directed. The
Right.
politicians themselves, they're not rewarded in most cases for in-depth knowledge on particular cases. Now, there were periods in the American Senate, and the American Senate has had a pretty rocky history. But there are periods in the American Senate where you had individuals who were very deeply and intimately knowledgeable about the topics in which they were legislating and setting the agenda for. But now, we have a system in which the incentives are, in order to get reelected, if you're a congressman or congresswoman, or if you're a senator, you need to, have name recognition. You need to be out there. So we tend to prioritize sound bites, and we tend to prioritize getting on television, and long, in-depth, nuanced discussions of the intricacies of some of these conflicts, some of these challenges that the United States are facing do not lend themselves well to 140 or 280 characters, or a 35-second sound clip on CNN or MSNBC or something on TikTok. It just doesn't work that way anymore. And because the incentives don't work that way anymore, and because the electorate doesn't demand it, then we tend not to see most of our politicians as having the sort of nuanced and intimate, detailed knowledge that you would want them in order to be making these decisions. I mean, the United States in particular is a representative democracy, and so we elect those who represent the electorate. And if we don't demand it, then they won't produce it, except in very rare cases where somebody sneaks through who has some knowledge.
Absolutely, and it's a very good point too. And well, I guess to that notion, then, it goes back to what we were initially talking about. Does it have to, should there be, maybe not incentive, but should there just be a journalistic desire or journalistic need, and to realize that there is a need for the people to understand these things, to put them in the news cycles more, to say, hey, they've not gone away. We may have, as I said before, pushed them to the wayside and forgot about them, but they are very much going on and having still very much impact, because, as you say, it's up to the electorate for themselves to take the reins and learn these things. But if they're not so easily accessible, as is most things, and no matter where one resides, what country, it's not going to be the thing they're going to actively seek out. More people are going to worry what's going on in their city, their state, their county, perhaps on a federal level what's going on, but it's not going to be worrying necessarily. As you said, foreign policy is the truthless element. It's not going to be something you're going to, let's say, judge a politician for. I would personally, but that's a me thing.
Well, I think it's Neil Postman was a Canadian, wasn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah, and he had that great book, Amusing Ourselves to Death, which is a book I think about probably 2 or 3 times a week, and how prophetic that book has turned out to be. I think there's a lot of journalists who want to spend more time reporting in these foreign areas, A, it's expensive.
Right.
B, it doesn't get the clicks or the readership that other things do. And so when you start looking at news as something that you can commodify and monetize and sell as a product, and less as a public service and more as a business venture, then you're going to start going to where it is that the consumer demands their products be, what they look like, what they talk about. And it can be, it's challenging to send somebody abroad, to pay for the translators in certain cases, or to pay for the security detail, or to have these individuals on the ground, and then for the reporters themselves to be able to gather the information, to be able to tell a story. Foreign news shouldn't just be sort of the potatoes on the side of your plate that you're trying to enhance your 6-year-old to eat. They should be something that can stand on their own as a main dish, but that's often not where it is that we're at. I don't think there's one simple reason for that. I think a lot of journalists would like that to be the case, and it's they are constrained by their editors, who are constrained by the publishers, who are constrained by business and advertising and all sorts of other factors. And so it's a systemic problem, as opposed to sort of one that we can go in and identify and say, well, if we change this, we'll get a better result.
Right, accurately. And that's more or less the same consensus that, if you're not familiar with, I know my viewers from season 2 are familiar with Jake Henrahan, founder of the independent conflict journalism Popular Front. And he says the same thing. He covers stories others won't, or the popularity reasons, but he knows the important elements there. And he says the same thing. Often too, it's a matter of the individual journalist is wanting to go there, but either the funding isn't there, and the security element might be so costly if it's depending where the conflict is. But no, I think you're right. Gregory, as I said at the top of the hour, it's an honor to have you here on the podcast, and I think your work and your views are most pertinent to this topic. And I hope nothing, neither institution or person or group ever shuts you up. I think your work is needed, and I think your voice is needed. So I thank you for what you do, and I'd love to have you on again sometime.
Yeah, it's been a real pleasure, Matthew. I appreciate it.
Yeah.